Hello and welcome. Today, Nora Calloway brings us a new story called The Long Way Round. Find a comfortable spot, settle in, and let the miles carry you. Act 1. The Proposition. The idea came from Josie, which surprised everyone except Loretta. Josie was 22 and had just finished college and was in the particular suspended state that follows the end of one chapter before the next has properly begun, a state her parents found worrying and her grandmother found entirely familiar. Loretta was 68 and recently widowed and living in the house she had shared with her husband Frank for 41 years, which was a large house for one person, as everyone kept pointing out to her in the careful way people point out things they want you to do something about. Josie had called on a Tuesday evening and said, without much preamble, "Grandma, do you want to drive to New Mexico with me?" Loretta had said, "When?" Josie had said, "Next week. I want to see the desert. I have never seen the desert." Loretta had said, "Neither have I." There had been a pause. Then Josie had said, "So we should go." Loretta had looked around the living room where she was sitting at the lamp Frank had chosen, and the rug they had argued about for 2 weeks before she won, and the curtains that needed replacing, and the shelf of books she had been meaning to reorganize since February. Then she had looked at the phone in her hand, and she had said, "All right." Her daughter Carol had called the following morning, which meant Josie had told her parents, which meant Carol had concerns. Carol had a gift for concerns. She had been a worried child and had grown into a worried adult, and Loretta loved her completely and found her exhausting in the particular way you find exhausting the people whose anxiety reminds you of your own. Carol said, "Mom, it is a very long drive." Loretta said, "I know, that is rather the point." Carol said, "Josie has never driven that far." Loretta said, "Neither have I. We will figure it out together." There was a silence of the specific texture that meant Carol was choosing between several things she wanted to say. She said, "Are you sure you are up for it? It has only been 4 months." Loretta understood what Carol was asking. She said, "Carol, your father would have wanted to go to the desert himself. He always meant to. We never got around to it. I am going now." Another silence. Then Carol said quietly, "Okay, Mom." Loretta spent the rest of the week in a state she did not have a precise name for. Not excitement exactly, though there was something of that in it. Not grief, though that was always present, moving through her days like weather, sometimes close and sometimes at a distance, but never entirely gone. Something that sat between the two, a kind of aliveness, a feeling that something was about to happen that she had not planned and could not predict, and that this was not a threat but a fact, and that facts of this kind were worth paying attention to. She packed lightly. She had always packed lightly, which Frank had found incomprehensible because Frank had packed for every contingency and then some, and she had loved this about him, even when it drove her quietly mad, the way you love the things about a person that are most entirely themselves. She left space in the bag for things she might find along the way. Josie arrived on a Sunday morning in a car that was older than it looked, and looked older than Loretta would have preferred. But she said nothing about this because Josie had checked it thoroughly and printed out a maintenance record, which Loretta had not asked for, but which she found oddly touching. The girl was careful in her own way, just not in the ways her parents tended to notice. They loaded the bags, and Josie stood beside the car, looking at the house the way young people look at things they are trying to memorize, with a seriousness that she probably did not know was visible on her face. Loretta locked the front door and stood on the porch for a moment. She thought about Frank. She thought about the 41 years of coming and going through that door, the ordinary accumulation of arrivals and departures that makes up a life lived in one place. She thought about the fact that this was the first time she was leaving without knowing when he would be there when she returned. She thought, he would have loved this. He would have had a map. He would have had strong opinions about the route. She thought, I am going to have to navigate. She got in the car. Josie said, Ready? Loretta said, Let's go. They drove west out of town in the early morning with the light coming at them low and gold across the flat land, and the road ahead empty, and the radio playing something Loretta did not recognize but found she did not mind. Josie drove with the particular focus of someone who takes driving seriously without making a performance of it. 2 hands on the wheel, eyes forward, the occasional check of the mirrors. Loretta watched the land change and drank coffee from the thermos she had brought and thought that there were worse ways to begin. She said, Tell me about this plan of yours. Why the desert specifically? Josie was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was deciding how honest to be. Then she said, I don't know what comes next. I thought, if I got somewhere that looked completely different from everywhere I've ever been, maybe that would help. Loretta said, Does that usually work? Josie said, I have no idea. I've never tried it. Loretta said, Your grandfather used to say that you can't think your way into the future. You have to walk toward it and let it appear. Josie said, That sounds like him. Loretta said, It was one of about 4 things he said regularly, but he was right about that one. Josie smiled without taking her eyes off the road. She said, What were the other 3? Loretta thought about it. She said, Never buy the cheapest version of anything you use every day. Always be the first one to apologize. And if someone makes you a meal, eat it. Josie said, That last one is very specific. Loretta said, He had a specific experience that led to it. I will tell you about it later. The morning opened up around them and they drove into it. Act 2, The Miles. They stopped for lunch at a diner in a small town neither of them had heard of, the kind of place with a counter and stools and a pie case that meant business. The woman who brought their coffee had been working there long enough that she moved through the room the way a person moves through their own home, without looking at anything because she knew where everything was. Loretta ordered the daily special. Josie ordered the same. When the food came, Josie looked at it and said, This is a lot of food. Loretta said, Eat it. Josie laughed. She said, Was that the specific experience? Loretta said, No. The specific experience involved your grandfather refusing a bowl of soup at your great Aunt Miriam's house, and Miriam not speaking to him for 6 weeks. He became a man who ate whatever was put in front of him after that. Josie said, 6 weeks is a long time to not speak to someone. Loretta said, Miriam had strong feelings about soup. They ate. The food was good in the unpretentious way that food is good when it has been made the same way for a long time by people who are not trying to do anything other than feed someone properly. Loretta thought about Miriam, who had been dead for 20 years and whom she had not thought about in nearly as long. The soup incident, the particular set of Miriam's jaw when she was offended. Frank doing his best to apologize, and Miriam accepting the apology on her own schedule, which was the 6th week. She thought about how many people she carried around with her without knowing it, the dead and the distant and the mostly forgotten, all present in the small details of things, surfacing in diners in unfamiliar towns over plates of good, ordinary food. She thought, this is what Frank meant. You walk toward the future and it appears, and what appears is not only what you expected, it is everything you brought with you that you forgot you were carrying. After lunch, they drove through the afternoon. The land had been changing since morning, slowly at first, and then with increasing commitment, flattening and opening and going a color that was not quite brown and not quite red, a color that seemed to belong to a different atmosphere than the one Loretta had spent her life in. Josie said, "Can I ask you something?" Loretta said, "You can ask me anything." Josie said, "What was it like when Grandpa died in the first days?" Loretta looked at the road ahead. She had been asked versions of this question by a number of people in the 4 months since Frank died, asked in the careful way people ask things they feel they ought to ask, but are not certain they want to hear the answer to. Josie was asking differently. She was asking because she wanted to know. Loretta said, "The first days were strange, not as painful as you might expect. The pain comes later, when the shock wears off and ordinary life resumes, and you reach for someone who is not there. The first days were more like being inside a very quiet room where time was moving at a different speed." Josie said, "Were you alone?" Loretta said, "Your mother was there, and your uncle, and various other people came and went. But yes, in the way that matters, I was alone. That is the nature of it." Josie said, "I'm sorry I wasn't there sooner." Loretta said, "Josie, you were there within 2 days." Josie said, "I know, but I keep thinking I should have come sooner." Loretta looked at her granddaughter's profile, the set of her jaw, the slight tension around her eyes that was not about the driving. She said, "Listen to me. You were there. You came and you stayed for 10 days, and you helped with things that needed doing, and you sat with me in the evenings when the evenings were the hardest part. You were there." Josie said, "Okay." Loretta said, "I am not saying okay to make you feel better. I am saying it because it is true." They drove in silence for a while after that, the comfortable kind of silence that is not an absence of connection, but an expression of it. Two people in a car moving through a landscape that asked nothing of them except that they keep going. Toward late afternoon, the light changed in the particular way it changes in open country, going from white to gold to something deeper, and the land around them began to show what it had been holding back all day, the color coming up in the rock and the earth and the long, flat distances like a curtain slowly raised. Josie said, "Oh," Loretta said, "Yes." They pulled over without discussing it. Josie turned off the engine and they sat looking at the landscape in the evening light, the red and amber of it, the particular quality of the silence, which was not like any silence Loretta had heard before. It had a depth to it, as if the land had been practicing silence for a very long time and had gotten very good at it. Frank would have gotten out of the car and stood in it with his hands in his pockets and his face turned toward the sky. She knew this about him. She thought, "I am seeing this for you. This is yours too." She did not say this out loud. She did not need to. Josie said quietly, "I understand why you wanted to come." Loretta said, "I think I am still figuring out why." Josie said, "Maybe that's the same thing." They sat until the light had finished doing what it was doing, until the color deepened into something too dark to properly describe, and then Josie started the car and they drove on toward the town where they were spending the night, following the headlights into the dark. Act 3: The Long Way. They spent 2 nights in the desert. They drove and they stopped, and they ate in places they had not expected to eat, and they talked the way people talk when they are moving, which is differently from the way they talk when they are still, more freely, with less concern for whether what they say is perfectly formed. Loretta told Josie about her own 20s, which she had not thought about in some time, the particular uncertainties of that decade, the feeling of standing at the beginning of something enormous without any reliable map. Josie said, "You felt like that too?" Loretta said, "Everyone feels like that. The ones who don't are the ones who stopped looking too early." Josie said, "Mom doesn't seem like she felt like that." Loretta said, "Your mother was very good at not showing it. That is a different thing from not feeling it." Josie absorbed this. She said, "She never told me." Loretta said, "Parents often don't. They want to seem like they know what they're doing. It seems important at the time. Later you realize the not knowing was the most useful thing you could have shared." Josie said, "Will you tell me more about being 22?" So Loretta told her. She told her about the job she had taken that was wrong for her, and the one after that which was less wrong, and the one after that which was right, in a way she had not expected and could not have predicted. She told her about the apartment she had rented with 2 women she had found through a notice on a board, strangers who had become friends who had eventually become people she exchanged cards with at Christmas and thought of warmly without quite keeping in touch. She told her about meeting Frank, which had not been a dramatic story, not the kind of meeting that makes a good telling, just 2 people at a gathering of mutual acquaintances who had ended up talking for 3 hours and discovered they had the same way of being interested in things. Josie said, "What way?" Loretta thought about it. She said, "Thoroughly. When something interested Frank, he went all the way into it. He didn't stay on the surface of things." Josie said, "You're like that too." Loretta said, "I learned some of it from him. Some of it was already there." Josie said, "I think I'm like that. I go all the way into things and then I don't know how to come back out." Loretta said, "That is not a flaw. That is a temperament. You learn to work with it." On the second morning they drove to a place they had read about, a stretch of desert where the rock formations rose from the flat ground in shapes that seemed impossible, too large and too particular to be accidental, though of course they were accidental, the work of wind and water across more time than either of them could properly imagine. They walked among them in the early morning light. Loretta was not a fast walker, and had not been for some years, and Josie adjusted her pace without being asked, which Loretta noticed and was grateful for without saying so. They walked and looked and were mostly quiet because the place did not invite much talking. It invited looking, and they looked. Loretta thought about Frank's heart, which had given out without much warning on an October morning, as hearts sometimes do. She thought about the fact that he had never seen this. She thought about all the places he had not seen, and all the things he had not gotten around to, and the ordinary injustice of a life ending before it has finished being curious. She thought, "But I am seeing it. I am here, and I am seeing it, and I will tell him about it in whatever way one tells the dead about things, which is an imprecise method but better than nothing." She thought, I am 68 years old, and I drove to the desert with my granddaughter, and I am walking among these rocks in the early morning, and I am completely here. I am not thinking about the house or the curtains that need replacing or the shelf I meant to reorganize. I am here. This felt important. Josie stopped beside a formation that rose from the ground in a long, curved shape and put her hand on the rock and held it there for a moment. Loretta stopped beside her. Josie said, I think I know what I want to do. I've been thinking about it for the past 2 days. Loretta said, Tell me. Josie said, I want to teach. Not the way people talk about teaching, not as a backup plan or a practical choice. I actually want to teach. I want to be in a room with people who are learning something and help them get further into it than they could get on their own. She said this quickly, the way people say things they have been holding for a while and are slightly afraid will sound wrong when they come out. Loretta looked at her granddaughter with her hand on the ancient rock and the morning light coming across the desert behind her, and she said, That is not a small thing to know about yourself. Josie said, You don't think it's too ordinary? Mom always talks about ambition like it means something specific. Loretta said, Your grandfather spent 40 years running a hardware store. He knew every person who came through that door and what they were building and what they needed and why. He went all the way into that. Was that ordinary? Josie was quiet. Loretta said, Ordinary is a word people use when they haven't looked closely enough. Everything is specific when you look at it closely. Teaching is specific. The room is specific. The people in it are specific. What you give them is specific. Don't let anyone call that ordinary. Josie took her hand off the rock. She looked at her grandmother. She said, I didn't know you thought about things like this. Loretta said, I have been thinking about things like this for 68 years. People assume grandmothers are for baking and advice about weather. We are actually for this. Josie laughed. It was a full laugh, unguarded, the kind she had had as a small child and that had deepened as she got older without losing its quality. Loretta thought, I have known this person for 22 years. I have known her as an infant and a child and an adolescent. And now, this, this young woman standing in the desert with her whole life still opening, and every version has been interesting. She thought, Frank would say I am partial. He would be right. She is extraordinary. They turned and walked back the way they had come, taking the long way around the base of the formation to see it from the other side, which looked entirely different, a new shape from a new angle, the same rock reconfigured by the movement of the viewer. On the drive home, they talked less and listened to the radio more, the comfortable quiet of people who have said the things that needed saying and can now rest in each other's company without filling every mile with words. The land changed back from desert to the greener, flatter country they had come from, and Loretta watched it go from something to something else and thought about journeys in general, the way they do what the destination alone cannot do, which is to give you time in motion, time that belongs only to the going and does not yet belong to the arriving. She thought about Frank and about Josie and about Carol and about Miriam and her soup and all the people she carried. She thought about the house waiting for her, the lamp and the rug and the curtains and the shelf. She thought, I will reorganize the shelf. She thought, I will replace the curtains, not because they need replacing, but because I want them to be mine. She thought, I will have Josie for dinner when we get back, and I will cook something proper, and when she compliments it, I will tell her how I made it. She thought, I am not finished. I have been feeling since October like a person in the final pages of a book, and I am not. I am somewhere in the long middle, where the best things tend to happen, where the characters have enough history to know themselves and enough road left to go somewhere new. The sun went down ahead of them as they drove east, and the sky did the thing it does at the end of a clear day, going through every color it knows in the space of half an hour. And Josie turned the radio down without being asked, and they watched it through the windshield together in silence. When it was done, Josie said, "Thank you for coming." Loretta said, "Thank you for asking." Josie said, "I didn't know it would be like this." Loretta said, "Like what?" Josie thought about it. She said, "Like talking to someone who actually knows things, not advice things, real things." Loretta said, "I am going to take that as the compliment I believe you intend it as." Josie said, "It is absolutely a compliment." They drove on into the dark, the headlights making a small, bright world on the road ahead, and everything else vast and quiet around them. And Loretta thought that this was what her husband had meant all those years when he said you have to walk toward the future and let it appear. He had not meant that the future would be what you expected. He had meant that the walking was the thing, that you kept going and you kept looking and you stayed interested, and the future arrived around you while you were paying attention to something else. She had driven to the desert with her granddaughter. She had not expected to feel this particular thing, which she did not have a name for exactly, which was somewhere between gratitude and recognition, the feeling of understanding something that had been waiting to be understood. She was 68 years old. She had a long way yet to go, and she found to her own considerable satisfaction that she was looking forward to it. End of novel.